The riding is a Tory stronghold and has been for 2 decades, but Javani did also succeed in increasing, as we said, his party's share of the votes from 2021, when the candidate then happened to be the leader of the Conservative Party at the time. What could the results tell us about national political battle lines? Let's bring in the front bench with me tonight. Former New Brunswick Liberal Premier Brian Gallant. He's now the CEO of Space Canada. Former Conservative Deputy Leader Lisa Raitt. She's the Vice Chair and Managing Director of Global Investment Banking at CIBC. CTV News political analyst and former NDP leader Tom Mulcair is with us, as is the Toronto Star's Queen's Park Bureau Chief Rob Benzie. Hi, everybody. Great to see you tonight. Lisa, I will start with you. The size of the victory is definitely not a small one. But in the past, when we have, talked about by-elections, everyone's like, oh, it's just a by-election, only 29% turnout. Like, is there more to this story in your view?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I think that the message is getting through. I think people who want to vote Conservative went out and voted, and people who are disenchanted with the NDP and the Liberals, either they gave their vote to the Conservatives or they ended up just staying home. I think it's a really big win. I do think it's a proxy for the general election, to be honest. And for me, I mean, I ran in the 2011 majority that Harper won. I mean, Bev Oda at that point, she got 53%, I think. And this is the highest share since. And Bev was a very well respected. That was a very rural riding at the time and quite the Conservative base. Now it's very urban, and he pulled off 57%. Congratulations, good for him.
Tom, in your view, do you think it is a proxy for the general?
I agree with Lisa on this one. I think that anybody who was believing that maybe the polling companies were all wrong at the same time had a bit of a wake-up call yesterday. I also agree with Lisa that there is a temporizing effect on people's ardor when they know that their candidate and their party don't have much of a chance. So I don't see much in the 10% result for the NDP other than the fact that a lot of NDPers just said, I think I'm going to pass on this one and stay home. I think Mr. Trudeau has to be very concerned with what he saw. And I have to say that Jamil Javani, I got a chance to do radio with him any number of times, and I always found him such a refreshing character. I would really keep my eyes on this guy when he finally makes it into the House. I think he's going to shake things up a bit.
Yeah, he's going to be definitely someone to watch. Rob, you were reporting today about some of the friction between him and the provincial government there. He worked in a number of different capacities. I should also disclose for our audience that he used to work for Bell Media, and he has filed a lawsuit claiming breach of contract and wrongful dismissal. Just for full disclosure, Bell Media, of course, owns CTV News. What's your impression of his potential star power and the meaning of this for the Tories?
I mean, Lisa's right. It's a big win for the Tories, much better than they did in Mississauga Lakeshore a year ago, which shows you that they've learned some lessons on how to run by-elections. So that's good for them. Mr. Javani is, as Tom says, a very good communicator, a Yale-educated lawyer. He's cited in J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. He's a friend of J.D. Vance, the senator from Ohio, who wrote that famous book a few years ago, and they were at Yale together. But Mr. Javani it's going to be interesting to see what a challenge he poses for the gatekeepers around Pierre Poilievre, because he has a healthy sense of self and he's a very confident guy. And I think last night when he attacked the quote-unquote liberal elites at the Ontario Ministry of Education, that ruffled a lot of feathers at Queen's Park. Premier Doug Ford, Education Minister Stephen Lecce, who doesn't really need a lecture on his Conservative credentials from anyone, really. I mean, Mr. Lecce worked for Prime Minister Stephen Harper when Lisa was in government. So I think there were a lot of people wondering why Jamil Javani, a former Ford staffer, would rail against the provincial government the way that he did last night. It's very odd.
On a wider scale, Brian, if you were in the Liberal war room, and I think it's prudent to point out, the Liberals showed up in droves to try and help their candidate. A lot of prominent ministers and MPs from the GTA. So did the Conservatives. Like the top echelon of organizers around Poilievre were there. Last night, one of our panelists said, well, there wasn't much better to do, but it seems like there was, a healthy amount of interest in what the outcome of this would be. Would you be worried that they were able, if you were among the Liberals right now, that the Conservatives were able to increase their vote share? Not just win in a secure riding, but increase their vote share?
So I wouldn't look too much into it, and only because the way that I kind of look at it, especially a by-election, as you mentioned, I think everything you mentioned in the preamble before the segment is true. It's a by-election. We shouldn't read too much into it, but can it give a signal? Sure. And I wouldn't sort of panic or anything just based on this, because if you got all the polling that we've seen before out of the way, and you just looked at these results in isolation, you had no narrative coming into the by-election, I'm not sure the Liberals would see that and panic. It's a stronghold. It's a by-election. I don't know if they would say, oh, wow, how did we not win? How did we not do that much better? That said, I think it does sort of confirm the narrative. So I definitely would suggest that the room in which you described, which I wasn't invited to, but the room that you described, that the Liberals in it say to themselves, look, this is confirming the narrative. The polls are real. I don't think they're really doubting the polls anyway, so I don't think they needed that. But this is definitely proof in the pudding. This is where the mood of the electorate is at the moment. No reason to think otherwise. So you really got to take that seriously and then start to take actions that will hopefully, for the Liberals' fortunes, be able to shift the mood and have people have the perspective on their government that they need going into the next election campaign.
Tom touched on this, Lisa, but the NDP outcome in this is also, I think, somewhat significant when you combine it with other by-election outcomes. What would you be reading into it if you were in the NDP circles?
That the working class vote is going to Conservatives, that the message is connecting. Durham has a pretty strong, I would say, NDP presence. They usually come second, I think, in that riding. And quite frankly, I would be concerned if I were both Liberal and NDP. Clearly, the Conservatives have wanted to go for that vote for a long time. They've been courting it. They've been saying the things that appeal to working class voters. And Tom will tell you about the blue-orange switch. It is real, and it's happening right here, right now, in real time.
They did something really interesting recently, Tom, the Tories, which wasn't heavily covered just because it was kind of in the progression of the way legislation works, but there's anti-scab legislation, and it needed to move to a different reading and required unanimous consent. And the Tories offered their consent to make it unanimous, which reveals to me exactly sort of what Lisa is laying out, that they're going hard after a vote that traditionally has gone to the NDP.
Yep, and they were not going to leave that on the table, and I was really surprised when they did it, but it was smart politics. They just looked at this thing saying it's going to pass one way or the other. Do we want to give them a cudgel to hit us with and saying, when the chips were down, when it was a question of anti-scab legislation, they were not with the workers, don't believe the Conservatives. The Conservatives were super smart, and that is being fleet-footed, to turn around that quickly and say, no, we're going to vote for this thing. We're going to give unanimous consent, as you just said, Vassy, and I think that Lisa's right. We did have that exact term for them. We used to call them, orange blue switchers, people who would, stay with their unions, stay close to the working class and stay close to the NDP as best representatives. They're looking around the room right now and saying, these guys are talking about stuff that I find important. My kids can't afford a house. I was able to buy a house. Why won't my kids be able to do that, even though they're working hard? Poilievre's been zeroing in on those affordability issues, key questions like housing. It's starting to pay off for him, and that's why it's showing up in the polls, and that's why it's showing up, as it did last night, in the ballot box, which is, of course, far more important than polls.